Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. A recent poll coming out of the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies has found that large majorities across the Arab world have disapproved, in fact, of these normalization deals and any normalization deals with Israel. 88%, at least in those countries that were polled, 13 countries approximately, disapproved of recognition of Israel by their own respective countries. This poll was not, though, conducted in some of the countries that have normalized ties right now with Israel, such as Bahrain, the UAE, and others as well, although it did include, very importantly, Saudi Arabia also. Let's discuss all of that a bit further with our esteemed panelist who's joining us this morning from Florida. We're joined by Dr. Robert Rabil, who is a professor of political science at Florida Atlantic University. Robert, thank you for your time this morning. What do you make of this poll? I mean, it seems that the governments are going one way and the people are still not completely on board.
Well, thank you for having me. Well, you have 2 points I would like to make here. The first point, this is normal because throughout the Arab-Israeli conflict, the regimes have indoctrinated the people about Israel and about hating Israel and about the conflict. So it is normal that we see too many Arabs, they don't have a good view of Israel. And the second point we have to make to have it and take it really into consideration is that you have to make a distinction between North Africa, the Levant, and the Gulf. The Gulf today, and the mindset of the Gulf, including the people of the Gulf, is totally different than the mindset of the Levant and the North African people.
Robert, I wonder, though, should we give the people more credit in the sense that they're not saying that normalization is completely off the table? What they're saying is, at least from my reading of the poll, when I looked into the details of it, is that this should be made conditional, at least for those who do accept diplomatic relations, that this should be conditional on the formation of an independent Palestinian state. I mean, on that point specifically, that's a reasonable demand, isn't it? Because till now, at least, the international community does want two states to come out of this.
Correct. On this point, you are absolutely right in that the people of the region, and by the way, many leaders of the region would like to have, a two-state solution. And this has been really, if you go back to the Beirut Peace Initiative by the Arabs led by Saudi Arabia, that was the condition. You normalize, you withdraw to the to the 1967 borders and will normalize all. But this has changed, This has changed a lot since then, especially with the emergence of the Iranian threat. So mainly those countries in the Gulf today, they are prioritizing their own national security interest more than the Palestinian cause, which to many, really, it is a just cause.
So then what do you think happens now, right? Because when we look at the details, and yes, of course, you made the very good point about the Iranians, right? And that's playing into all of these normalization of ties. But nevertheless, when you look at the details of these normalization of ties, there isn't actually a specific mention, for example, of two states. I mean, in some ways, do you think that for the people, the Arab street, to view that as sort of giving in too much, is that a fair, legitimate concern on their part?
Well, if you read the Arab news, and if you read it, for example, in Lebanon, if you read it in Jordan, if you read it in Algeria or in Egypt, indeed, you have many op-eds that were written that they were not happy that there was no article or a provision, to say, okay, let's not, add any more settlement. What do you have? You have suspension of settlement for the time being. So you don't know what Israel is going to do in the near future. And this is a good point. But the fact is, really, to go back to the Gulf, and especially the UAE and Bahrain, and I don't know in the future whether Oman to follow suit, is that, they have bigger issues than the Palestinian cause. And also, there is a point I would like you to consider, and I would like all the listeners to consider, especially when it comes to the Gulf leadership and the Palestinian leadership. Something that the Gulf leader, and I know that, and I felt it, and I spoke with some in the Gulf, they still have certain resentments that goes back to the 1990 Gulf War, when the Palestinian leadership sided with Saddam Hussein. And it's really deep into their psyche. So you have more than one factor that led the Gulfi to go ahead and normalize their relation. First, now they are pursuing policy that is first Gulf, second the Palestinian cause, and second you have issue with the leadership of the Palestinians.
Let's talk about the leadership of the Palestinians, because we know, and you probably know this much better than I do, that the Palestinians have had internal issues, right, for quite a long time now, right? They haven't had elections for God knows how long now. I mean, ever since Mahmoud Abbas has taken over, 15 odd years at the very least. Do you think that that will actually happen? Because now there is talk, of course, of Palestinians uniting because of these normalization of ties and the pressure that this has brought now upon both the Palestinian Authority, Hamas, and other groups?
Well, for the Palestinian, yes, it should happen. It should bring the two people together, one leadership, and let them, begin or resume the peace talks with the Israelis and have a better contact with the Gulf and other leaders, including Arabs. But based on the past, you have many attempts that have been done. Let's not forget, for example, Saudi Arabia at one time played a very serious role, and a great role in bringing Hamas and Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian National Authority. Then you have Egypt. Egypt has always played a role. And somehow they agreed the first day, but after a few days, it will collapse. So really you have a structural disagreement, the structural, also ideological views. They are totally different between the Palestinian National Authority and Hamas. I hope really, I do hope that the Palestinians will come together, and they need one leadership. They need to work together so they could go and present themselves as one, as one camp. Because Israel, when sometimes what it goes and speak to the world, it speak, listen, with whom I'm going to speak? Am I going to speak with the West Bank and leave Gaza alone? So yes, I totally agree with you. They have to come together, and they have to have, one camp that speaks in one word, one logic, with the Israelis, with the Arab world, and with the international community especially.
Back to a point you made earlier, Robert, about the fact that, these Gulf countries are putting themselves first, right? And that's completely fine. I mean, but then the way that they've presented, at least one or two, I believe both governments, in fact, both the UAE and Bahrain, presented this still in a way where they were doing almost a favor for the Palestinians, in the sense, of course, as you mentioned, the suspension of those settlements also. Why didn't they just come out and say, listen, we're just going to put ourselves first and we'll put the Palestinians second? I mean, why present it in a fashion that we're also still concerned about the Palestinian issue when that wasn't their priority? I mean, why not just admit it? Do you think that that almost shows in some way that the Arab street, even possibly their own citizens, are not necessarily completely in line with what the Emirati and Bahraini governments are doing?
Well, correct. But also you have to consider one thing in the Arab world, and especially with the leadership of the Arab world, and more so with the Gulf, what they say in public is something, and what they say in private is something else. In private, they have been talking about it for quite some time. Let's not forget, since 1990, you had formal talks and informal talks. And once the formal talks somehow were suspended, they kept the informal talks, especially with United Arab Emirates and with Bahrain and with the blessing of Saudi Arabia. Let's not forget that. When Prince Bandar bin Sultan was the Saudi ambassador here, he's the one who initiated those talks. So mainly what do you have? You have a background of informal talks that Israel, by the way, played a key role in maintaining them and enhancing them. So from the Gulf leadership, what they have done, really nothing except, what you have in private, they turn it into public. So mainly it wasn't that big decision for them. And as I mentioned to you, in the Arab world, let's not forget, you don't have the democracies that are prevalent in the Arab world. So the leaders take the initiative.
Robert, we'll have to leave there as a final word, but we do sincerely appreciate your taking your time out of your busy schedule to speak to us this morning there from Florida. That was Robert Rabil sharing his expertise with us about this latest poll that has come out showing, as I said, 88% of Arabs, at least in 13 of the countries that were polled, disagree with any possible recognition on the part of their respective countries of Israel and normalization of ties with Israel. As I said in my intro, this poll did not include citizens in Bahrain and the UAE, both of which countries have normalized ties so far with Israel, and I believe also did not include Oman, which may possibly, as Robert there also indicated, may very well normalize ties. Also, that's at least the talk on the street. What does that mean going forward? Does that mean that there is this disconnect between the Arab street and the Arab governments, or is this something else altogether to begin with? Of course, a lot to understand and discuss when it comes to this issue of Palestinians, but what's most important is for them to unite and then try to stand on their own 2 feet and to deal with their issues on their own 2 feet and themselves, as Palestinian officials have said time and again, ever since at least these normalization of ties were made public. I'll be back with the next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, a 16-month congressional, that is U.S. congressional investigation into big tech companies, and I'm talking about the likes of Amazon, Apple, Google, and Facebook, has found that these tech giants, which pretty much, as all of us know, have quote-unquote monopoly power in key business segments, and they have abused their dominance in the marketplace as well, even at some points, stopping innovation or discouraging innovation, especially by smaller tech companies, which, of course, are not able to compete with these larger companies at an equal level. Now, there's been talk for many, I would say, years or at least months for breaking up these sort of tech companies as well, especially the likes of Facebook. And, of course, Amazon has come under criticism a lot of recent also. Is that the way to go? Is the way to deal with the situation to break up these companies? And certainly this is not an issue that is only of concern to the U.S. Congress. This is an issue that the EU has brought up a number of times. There have been a number of cases filed there, and there's talk amongst antitrust lawyers there as well about how to deal with the situation globally also. Because in the hands of these tech companies, essentially, we are in many ways slaves to them or prisoners to them and their policies politically or however they want to design things for the rest of us when it comes to social media and the various other aspects connected to their industry. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Albert Fox-Cahn, who is the founder of the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project. He's joining us this morning from Brooklyn, New York. Albert, as always, we appreciate your time and for joining us here in Scope. What do you make of the investigation, its conclusions? I mean, it doesn't seem to come up with anything surprising, but do you think something will finally now be done?
Thank you so much for having me. This is really a historic milestone in the fight to try to push back against the monopolistic power that these large tech firms have acquired. And we're really seeing, an effort to try to modernize antitrust theory, which, is based on statutes in the United States that are over 100 years old, to deal with the sort of power that comes in the digital age. So looking at the way that things like the App Store and the Amazon Marketplace are used to, basically squash innovation, extort monopolistic rents, and really get unprecedented control over all of us.
And, there's a huge, at least I'm talking about specifically when it comes to Facebook, for example, how Facebook operates has huge political ramifications, doesn't it? Social political ramifications, even around the world. And we've seen this play out many times when it comes to hate crime speech and all of the above. And I don't want to completely connect two unrelated issues, but there's a lot of concern just about the way social media companies also operate, isn't there? And do you think that should also be included in all the concerns that we're talking about?
Yeah, and so when we're talking about antitrust, we've historically thought about threats to consumers, but with this report, we're looking at a broader array of threats. And I think many of us in civil society are saying that we need to look at the threat that these technologies pose to democracy itself, because we are undermining some of the core checks in our countries where we're deploying these platforms that have the power to change the outcome of elections, that have the power to inspire, hate crimes, and in some cases even facilitate genocide. And so we need a broader set of tools in order to address these harms. But I think really the key part of this report coming from the majority staff was the need to identify the harms to workers, to competitors, to a broader array of people, not just consumer harm, but the way that these technology platforms are really undermining much of our economy and consolidating unprecedented power.
And obviously, as expected, the four tech giants have denied that they monopolize the marketplace, that they hurt competition in any way. Their argument is that they've become this size and this big because they have competed well when it comes to how they've dealt with the marketplace globally. Is that a fair point?
Look, I used to represent some of these tech firms, and that's what their lawyers tell them to say, because they have to claim that they're not monopolists or they'll get broken up. They'll face all of these consequences. But the truth is that they have used their scale to thwart competition. In the case of Facebook, they bought up many of their biggest rivals. They bought up Instagram. They bought up all of these other firms that had the potential to create alternative social networks. And now, according to this report, Facebook often would see the biggest threat to its own business coming from Instagram, its own subsidiary. And so we end up in this absurd situation where you have these monopolists competing only with themselves to the extent they're competing at all, locking in massive user bases, really immune from any competition. And so what does that mean? It means they can degrade the quality of their service. It can provide a much weaker experience for customers. And in the case of social media networks, that can also translate into really negative implications for the democratic process as we see more, misinformation, propaganda, and manipulative content, dominating these platforms.
Exactly. On that point of democracy, right? We've just recently had Facebook, I believe, announce, what was it, $250 million, I think, that it was going to give to politicians for their respective campaigns across the U.S. And there's, I think, there's a bit of a tug of war now to try to get at that money, I believe. Do you think now these companies are realizing that they need to do more vis-a-vis lobbying of politicians, and that also then is dangerous because in essentially you're buying for silence?
Can't speak to the specifics of that Facebook example. Tech has been the largest lobbyist in DC for many years now. They're outspending the oil and gas industry. They're outspending big auto. They're outspending big tobacco. They're outspending all of these other industries because they know that they largely are only able to play the role that they're playing today because of lax regulatory enforcement by antitrust officials and a tax code that allows them to really avoid paying a lot of the corporate taxes that firms with their sorts of profits should. And so they are constantly trying to push lawmakers to protect them from liability, protect them from antitrust enforcement, protect them from really anything that could stifle their monopolistic growth.
All right, I'm going to voice the conversation. We're also now joined by William Kovacic, who is a professor at George Washington University Law School and is also director of the Competition Law Center of JW. He's also the non-executive director of the UK Competition Markets Authority. He's joining us this morning from Washington, D.C. William, good morning to you, and thank you for joining us here in Scope. What are your thoughts, William, about this investigation, this congressional investigation, its conclusions, and as well as, now then the talk of whether or not these big tech giants should then be broken up?
I think the report is probably going to be the focal point for deliberations in the Congress in the coming year. It seems quite likely that the Democratic Party will not only have the White House, but both chambers of Congress. So the attention is likely to turn to the report as a foundation for proceeding. Just one initial comment. Most of the fundamental changes will require legislation, although it is also likely that by the end of this calendar year, the Department of Justice, the Federal Trade Commission, and our state governments will have initiated major cases against two or more of the tech giants, the main targets being Google and Facebook. So by the time Joseph Biden would become the president, should he be elected, there will already be two, perhaps three major cases running already that will seek to accomplish a number of the objectives that are set out in the report. And a major purpose of the report was to encourage the government agencies to do more with what they have and to step on the accelerator to proceed further with them. Legislation is likely to take longer. If we look at the Dodd-Frank experience after the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, it took Congress approximately 18 months in the face of a near destruction of the United States economy to adopt financial services regulatory reforms. I wouldn't imagine that this process would go any faster, so that new legislation likely would not be adopted until well into 2022, perhaps toward the end of the year. So for the next 2 years, fully for the next 2 years, the main vehicle for addressing the concerns raised in the report will be litigation. It will be the prosecution of the major cases that are likely to be launched within the next 2 months, with the Department of Justice perhaps going ahead next week. So it will be in the courts that in the short term that these issues are going to be addressed. And those cases could run 3 to 5 years each.
All right, so just in layman's terms, if you can, William, where do you think that the long-term solution in this lies, right? As I said, is it in breaking up these companies because they've just become too large for the good of the rest of us? Because, this isn't obviously something that is an issue which concerns only the United States. In my intro, I also talked about the EU and how the EU is also concerned about antitrust laws and how these very large tech giants have acted towards Europeans. And I imagine we can probably stretch that to the rest of the world also.
Well, one possibility is that the initiation and running of the cases that will begin by themselves will have a powerful effect. It is a somewhat contested hypothesis, but there is some persuasive evidence to suggest that the initiation of the big lawsuit by itself chastens the incumbent company and gives other firms breathing room. So one very strong possibility is that as these cases develop, that we will see the affected companies begin to back off some, that they'll stop acquiring nascent rivals, that they will relax contractual terms and conditions that have been a source of great concern. So one possibility to take seriously is that the very fact that the cases are running by themselves will have a significant remedial effect. I think for the longer term, though, the solution is likely to reside in policymaking tools that bring together 3 separate disciplines: competition law, consumer protection law, and data protection or privacy law. And that is likely to come about through the application of administrative policymaking tools. In the U.S., the most likely platform would be the Federal Trade Commission, and the use of prescriptive rulemaking power in order to draw upon all 3 of these disciplines to prescribe limits on behavior. I think for the long term, that's the likely solution. But I would not underrate the power of these cases to have an effect.
All right. I know you wanted to react as well. Go ahead.
Yeah, I wish I thought William was right that legislation would be forthcoming on this, but I'm very skeptical that we'll see any meaningful changes to U.S. competition law, in the next decade. I mean, the core statutes at issue here really haven't been changed in a century, but what we have seen is changes in the regulatory interpretation of those statutes, the court decisions that interpret them, and so what I do think we will see is regulators using this report to really try to redefine the scope of the existing statutory authorities, to push back against some of the interpretations that began during the Reagan administration and continued through the Obama administration and the Trump administration that really redefined a lot of the protections of U.S. competition law to carve out the type of behavior we're seeing here. And I think that will be important. But I also know that, we're already in talks with state regulators, with federal agencies, and we know groups across the country are doing the same as part of a broader push to have them take actions now under the existing authorities, because a lot of the behavior we see here, it really isn't clear that the firms have this sort of carve out from competition law that they've claimed and that they've used for so many years to avoid any meaningful antitrust enforcement.
William, I'll give you the final word before I let both of you go, and I'll let you respond to what Albert there brought up as a concern to what you had said earlier. I also wanted to add this on, the lobbying power of the tech firms, as Albert and I had spoken about earlier also, that's huge, right? So when you have money, politics, all mixed into the mold as well, that makes all of this that much more challenging to resolve?
Yeah, I mean, Albert raises a fair point. I think the main footnote to add to his point is that all of these efforts by regulators to use existing tools to make adjustments will find their way into the courts, so that the jurisprudence he described will still be an obstacle to implementing the broader vision. But the only way that the agencies have a chance to effectuate this kind of change is to try. I think you've seen a great deal of risk aversion in recent decades, the sense that we're going to lose, why bother? The only way to press the issue is to bring forward the cases. And I think what Congress is saying in the report is, we don't care if you lose. If you lose, that heightens the urgency for us to try to pursue legislation. Your question on lobbying is exactly right. When in the past you threaten business enterprises with major restructurings, whether it's petroleum in the 1970s, a host of other agencies, they mobilize all of the resources they possibly can to oppose it. And a question that could be asked if we have another presidential debate is to Mr. Biden is, will you embrace this report? And my guess is his answer will be everything's on the table. But that's Washington speak for saying, I don't want to commit myself to any of this. There's nothing in the background of Mr. Biden or Ms. Harris that suggests that they'll embrace the big vision that's in the report. So it is doubtful, given the political dynamics that we see, that you will have a sturdy coalition to support the big remedies, the big solutions, the structural separations and divestitures. That all pushes you in the direction of compromise outcomes that involve some intervention, some controls, but not a fundamental retooling, root and branch restructuring of the system.
I believe there's a final word, but we do sincerely appreciate both William and Albert for their time this morning and for sharing their expertise with us on this issue about, investigation into these four big tech giants, i.e. Amazon, Apple, Google, and Facebook. And Google and Facebook, of course, have always come under more criticism, but of course, Amazon and Apple's role and the concerns about them as well when it comes to antitrust laws is just as valid and legitimate. And this is a concern not just, of course, in the United States, as I put to our guests, but also in the European Union and globally. So what the U.S. is doing now vis-a-vis this 16-month congressional investigation and the report that's come out in its conclusions is also then something that the rest of the world is watching with bated breath to see how this will all then pan out, how the companies will react, whether or not they will be quote-unquote held to account, will they be broken up? I mean, these are very large solutions that we're speaking of and very tough solutions to deal with because there's just so many complications to this issue. But nevertheless, are these companies too big for the rest of our good? Should they be broken up? They do certainly need to be reined in somehow, but it needs to be done in a responsible fashion and done properly. And again, the mix of money and politics is always something which muddies the waters, doesn't it? I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Sculpt with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss QAnon, the movement, which Facebook has now classified as a dangerous movement and has removed, or is in the process, I should say, of removing affiliated groups, accounts, pages, etc., that encourage that conspiracy theory. And it's a far-right conspiracy theory, which talks about, which started off, in fact, I should say, by an anonymous internet poster nicknamed Q, who claims to be a Trump administration insider and says that Trump is leading a crackdown against a pedophile ring that includes prominent Democrats and even Hollywood elite. Now, everybody says this is conspiracy theory, but nevertheless, it seems to now have a strong enough support base that it is of now concern to, of course, Facebook and other social media giants. That has been of concern to many of those who have been studying, of course, extremist movements on the far right as well. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Cahn, who was previously a policy and legal intern for the U.S. Senate and New York Senate Division of Human Rights. She is joining us this morning from Buffalo, New York. Joining us this evening from Brisbane, Australia, is Shane Satterley, who is a radicalization researcher. He's a PhD candidate at Griffith University. Shane and Oma, thank you both for your time today. Shane, let me start with you. QAnon, I didn't know too much about it, to be very honest, before going into this show. But I mean, the theory itself sounds really odd and weird because I've heard about that just through the Clinton, Pizza Gate, etc. Just if you can, how concerning is this, or is just very fringe and not of concern?
Well, the concern is where the the ideology may lead to violence. Obviously, conspiratorial thinking is an issue. It's been an issue for forever, just about. But at presently, it's a bit too early, I think, to tell just how ideologically driven some of the few incidences that we have on record where some of these people have committed crimes or some acts of violence. So, but nevertheless, the FBI has put them forward as not put them forward specifically, but conspiratorially minded extreme ideas. They've really highlighted that that could be a potentially violent threat going forward.
And Oma, it seems that they find some support, don't they? Especially when it comes to QAnon, with the president and even Republican congressional candidates who haven't directly necessarily always supported it by name, but seem to imply and implicitly support it.
Yes, Waqar, it's 100% true. There's many times where the president himself has given support, where there's a fact checker, it's live, where he has supported them, that they're very fine people. There's times where even it shows the guards where they're wearing or militants when they're wearing the Q sign on their uniform. This is not the first time. There's many members of of the Senate, the Congress, that have condemned it, but also his supporters and his people from his cabin who have openly, even mentioned it, have given it, positive views. So this isn't the first time the president has led a direct campaign that consists of white supremacy, and he seems to almost serve as a leader of it. The way he has supported these people, it's not too far from the debate where he took a really long time first not condemning white supremacy terrorism, saying Proud Boys, stand here, stand by. And then after that, we're seeing this. And then just the other day, we see Department of Homeland Security calling white supremacy terrorism the biggest threat. It's about time. This group, Facebook, has said that there's been over 1 million followers for the past 3 years. So it took Facebook long enough to condemn these hate groups and take them off. But when it comes to, Islamic extremist groups, they're quick to call it out, whether they see violence committed or not. So, the hypocrisy that we're seeing in the situation and the danger that Americans are being put by these groups is unacceptable. If it was Congresswoman we've seen when someone has called out Trump or during Trump's COVID treatment when he first got it, we saw people saying, negative things, and Facebook and social media was quick to call out that, don't say anything bad about the president. But when it was a Congresswoman, Alexandria Ocasio, Ilhan Omar, there was death threats here and there 24/7, but Facebook never took it down, Twitter never took it down in the name of freedom of speech. So where is that freedom of speech when it comes to the other side? So the hypocrisy that we're seeing in this day and age is unacceptable.
That's a very good point, Shane. For many, that does strike us when we see how this is being dealt with. Finally, of course, we're all glad that it's being dealt with, because obviously the vast majority of us do not support violence against any innocents in any fashion, or prejudice, bias, hatred of any form. But nevertheless, do you think that governments around the world have been slow to react to this? The social media giants have been slow to react to this movement?
Well, in some respects, the social media companies, it was never on their job list to begin with. They're private organizations, or at least they started out, that way, and now they're more sort of public infrastructure. So whilst anyone has the legal right to say whatever they want, Facebook started off with the right to be able to take down anything that they want. But now that they've become such a public space for discourse, there's an argument that all ideas should be allowed on there, unless, of course, they're calling for violence. So I don't agree with Facebook banning any particular set of ideas, because I think it's antithetical to one of the cornerstones of the way the US and other liberal democracies make freedom of expression, freedom of thought, freedom of speech a key issue, because these ideas sometimes are proven to be right. Now, I'm not sympathetic to conspiratorial theories 99% of the time, but if there is evidence that comes to light that some crazy idea might actually be true, then we want to hear about it. These are founding principles of liberal democracy, but obviously with the caveat of a call for violence, like what we saw with ISIS propaganda being taken down. That's a lot different.
All right, so how does one deal with this now going forward, right? There seems to now be this ever more realization around the world, not just in the US, that the right-wing extremism is of concern to all of us, really, as in, I'm speaking about especially the Western world. Do you think that finally there will be action taken?
Honestly, if there's not, already everyone's life's in danger. I think regardless, when it comes to social media, it's been a hub for these groups, for all, sort of groups that call for danger and extremism. And white supremacy terrorism is no less. So if in the past, when you see Charlottesville, so many white supremacist attacks that have been done, there's always been a social media link to it. And it's just, to me, if there's any sort of call for danger, regardless of whether we've seen it or not, if a group is presenting violence, like almost a new civil war, then regardless of whether they've shown any violence before or danger, they need to be taken down. It's unacceptable to see this hypocrisy. And I think the way to deal with it is, listen to your previous Homeland Security Commissioner. He said that this was a threat since 2017, and Trump's administration downplayed it, which they apparently deny now, which is not, I don't think it's surprising that they deny facts. And I think the way to deal with it is to, instead of calling freedom of speech, when it comes to these white supremacist groups, a lot of them which are, right-wing extremist Trump supporters, they need to shut it down. So just like the other day when the governor, when there was a whole bunch of, white supremacists that were planning the kidnapping of the Michigan governor, this is no less. You need to call for an action. His response was not surprising. He didn't really call for much of an action. He had support. So I think you need to demolish these groups, stop treating as a freedom of speech. If they're calling for violence, you demolish, get rid of them, treat them just like any other terrorist in this country has been treated.
I should give you the final word, and I just wanted to, highlight a report that I was just reading about before coming on air about right-wing extremism posing a quote-unquote creeping threat to liberal democracy in Australia, and that's according to a new study that's come out there, where you're sitting by a number of universities, I believe, who work together on this. Now, we know that Australian intelligence also has been concerned for a while now about the far-right extremism there also, and, we had Brenton Tarrant, an Australian who carried out that terrorist attack in Christchurch. Also, do you think that it's time for all of the above governments to work together on this? Do you believe that's already happening and that needs to then pick up pace?
Yeah, that's right. If we look over the last year or two, we still see sort of jihadism worldwide being at the most. That's the most amount of terrorism we see is from jihadists, but the fastest growing is from the far right, and so it needs to be taken seriously by all governments, obviously, and that's what I think the US is doing with the FBI, giving these conspiratorial groups sort of a new sort of classification, or just at least a noting to watch out for them. But yeah, here in Australia is no different. We're part of the global community. We consume the exact same media, so we see the same conspiratorial far-right nonsense that floats around online. And during these times of sort of rapid social change and political unrest, these are times when you do see the far-right rear its ugly head, more so than some other times. We saw it during the 1918 flu, for example. Anytime where you have sort of collective trauma, collective hurt, political unrest, modernization, all these sorts of things lead to dangerous ideas that get more organized.
Very well. Well, the final word, but we do sincerely appreciate both Shane and Oma for their time and for sharing their expertise with us. We got through quite a few topics there connected to QAnon, topics of free speech, hate speech, calling for violence, the limits on all of the above, and then, of course, hypocrisy and double standards possibly on the part of governments and social media companies about how they deal with different kinds of hate speech and different kinds of calls for violence. Why did it take this long for Facebook to react to QAnon and other many such groups, right-wing groups I'm specifically speaking about, online that many of us have witnessed and that have had ramifications on the ground. These ideas spread online, after all, to the likes of Brenton Tarrant and others who have carried out such attacks on the ground. So, these have very real-world consequences also in violence. And that, of course, is something that needs to be reeled in and dealt with ASAP. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.